My 3 children conspired to take everything I had built over 50 years. They thought I was old and didn't understand anything. I stood behind the door and heard every single word. The next morning, I did something that made them all go pale. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I am 74 years old. I want to tell you a story, not a pretty one, not a comfortable one, but one that is entirely true. It is the story of how the 3 people I loved most in this world decided that I had outlived my usefulness and how I proved them wrong. I spent 50 years building something, not a fortune, mind you. Nothing so grand as that, but something real. My late husband Gerald and I bought our house on Maple Creek Road in 1974, the year after we married. We paid for it slowly, painfully, with Gerald's salary from the machine shop and my income from the elementary school where I taught 2nd grade for 31 years. We raised our children in that house. Linda, the oldest, then Robert, then Patricia, the baby. We replaced the roof twice, the furnace once, repainted the shutters every decade. Gerald planted the oak tree in the backyard the year Robert was born. That tree is now 46 years old, taller than the house itself. Gerald died in 2019. Heart attack. Sudden. On a Tuesday morning in March. He was 71. We had been married 46 years. After he was gone, the house felt enormous, every room an echo. But I did not consider leaving it. That house was my life. It was the last place I had been truly, completely happy, and I was not ready to surrender it. My children were attentive at first. They called regularly. Linda drove up from Richmond every few weeks. Robert, who lived only 20 minutes away in Fairfield, stopped by on Sundays. Patricia, the youngest, called from Denver every Saturday morning. I was grateful. I told myself, look at what Gerald and I raised. Good people, loving people. The first warning sign, if I am being honest, came about 8 months after Gerald's funeral. It was subtle. So subtle that I dismissed it at the time. Linda mentioned, very casually, over coffee at my kitchen table, that she had spoken with a financial advisor about estate planning for older parents. She said it warmly, with that lovely Richmond smile of hers. She said she only wanted to make sure I was protected. I thanked her. I did not think twice about it. The second sign came that winter. Robert suggested I might be happier in a senior community. He had brochures. He had printed them, organized them into a folder, labeled with sticky notes. He had done research. He presented it the way a salesman presents a product. Gently, but with clear preparation. I told him I was fine. He nodded and put the folder away. But his eyes lingered on the walls of my living room, the way a buyer's eyes linger at an open house. Patricia began calling less on Saturdays and more on Tuesdays. The same day each week, always asking the same questions. How was I feeling? Any dizziness? Any confusion? Had I seen Dr. Marsh recently? Her concern felt scripted in a way I could not quite name. By spring of last year, the 3 of them were visiting together more often, which had never been their habit before. They would gather in the kitchen while I was resting, speaking in low voices. I told myself they were coordinating, the way adult children coordinate, dividing responsibilities. I told myself this because I wanted it to be true. Then came the night I found out the truth. It was a Thursday in April. I had gone to bed early with a headache, but I could not sleep, and around 10 o'clock, I came downstairs for a glass of water. Linda, Robert, and Patricia were in the living room. The door was nearly closed. I stopped in the hallway, and I stood there in the dark in my slippers, and I listened. Linda was speaking. Her voice was not the warm Richmond voice I knew. It was flat and businesslike, the voice of someone running a meeting. "She's not going to agree willingly," Linda said. "So we have to move before she understands what's happening. The house alone is worth $400,000. With the accounts, we're looking at close to $600 total." "She trusts her own name on things," Robert said. "That's the problem. We need her to sign the power of attorney before she gets suspicious." "She won't fight it," Patricia said. "She's old. She gets tired. If we present it right, she'll sign and think she's doing the sensible thing." I stood in that dark hallway, and I did not move. I did not breathe. I counted the flowers on the hallway wallpaper, the same wallpaper Gerald and I had chosen in 1989, and I waited until my heart stopped slamming against my ribs. Then I walked quietly back upstairs, sat down on the edge of my bed, and I thought, so this is what it has come to. I did not cry that night. I was too angry to cry. I sat on that bed until 2 in the morning. Below me, I could hear the muffled sounds of my children leaving. Linda's car first, then Patricia's rental, then Robert's truck. The house went quiet, and I sat in that quiet, and I took stock of everything. What exactly did I have? I went through it in my mind the way you go through a filing cabinet, methodically, without flinching. The house on Maple Creek Road, paid in full since 2001. Gerald's life insurance payout, which I had invested conservatively, about $140,000 in a Fidelity account. My teacher's pension, modest but steady, just over $1,800 a month. A savings account with roughly $42,000. My car, a 2018 Honda Accord. Gerald's woodworking tools in the garage, which I had kept because I could not bear to part with them. A small collection of jewelry. Nothing spectacular, but sentimental, and worth perhaps $8,000 or $9,000 at appraisal. $600,000. That was what Linda had said. Close to $600 total. She had counted my life like a grocery bill, and the power of attorney. That was what frightened me most. A durable power of attorney signed in a moment of tired compliance would give whoever held it the legal authority to manage my finances, make decisions about my property, even arrange for my care. It was the key to everything. If I signed it, believing, as Patricia had said, that I was simply doing the sensible thing, they could move money, sell the house, place me somewhere comfortable and out of the way, and there would be very little I could do about it afterward. I am a retired school teacher, not a lawyer. But I had lived 74 years, and I had not done so by being a fool. The fear came in waves that night. It was not a sharp, dramatic fear. It was the cold, creeping kind, the kind that settles in your bones. These were my children. Linda had been a colicky baby, and I had walked her for hours in the dark. Robert had broken his arm at 10 falling from Gerald's oak tree, and I had held his hand in the emergency room. Patricia had called me sobbing from a college dormitory at 19 when her first serious boyfriend ended things, and I had driven 4 hours to be with her. These were people I had held, people I had bled for, in the quiet, ordinary way that mothers bleed. And they had sat in my living room and discussed how to take everything from me. By the time the first light came through the curtains, I had made my decision. I was not going to run. I was not going to confront them in a panic and give them the opportunity to reassure me and regroup. I was going to be smarter than they expected a tired old woman to be. I had one immediate advantage. They did not know I had heard them. My first instinct was to call someone, a friend, a neighbor. But I stopped myself. Any conversation could be reported back. Linda, in particular, was friendly with my neighbor Cecile, who lived 3 doors down and had a sympathetic ear and a loose tongue. No, I needed to be careful. I needed to think before I spoke. I made myself a cup of coffee. I sat at Gerald's kitchen table, the one he had built himself from reclaimed barnwood, the one I had sat at every morning for 30 years. And I wrote in a notepad. Not a diary, nothing sentimental. A list, what they want, what they plan to do, what I need to stop it. What they wanted was clear. Control of my assets and ultimately my property. What they planned was equally clear. Maneuver me into signing documents that would strip me of legal authority over my own life. What I needed was a lawyer, not a family friend, not someone who had ever met Linda or Robert or Patricia. And I needed one before they made their next move. I also needed to know what I was dealing with legally. Was what they were describing elder financial abuse, fraud, or simply aggressive estate planning that, while morally repugnant, was not yet technically illegal? I did not know. That was the next thing to find out. I looked at my notepad. I had always taught my second graders that the first step to solving any problem was to write it down and look at it clearly. I had been right about that. Written down, my situation was frightening. But it was not hopeless. I was still legally competent. I still owned everything in my own name. I had not signed anything, and I intended to keep it that way. I had not been inside a law office in 11 years, not since Gerald and I had updated our wills after Patricia's wedding. That had been a pleasant enough occasion, sitting across from a mild-mannered man named Harold Sutter, who specialized in estate planning and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. Harold had retired, I knew. I was going to need someone new. I did not Google lawyers from my home computer. I did not want that search history anywhere near a device my children might someday access. Instead, I drove to the public library on Wednesday morning, sat down at one of the public terminals in the back corner, and spent an hour researching elder law attorneys in our county. I was looking for someone with experience in elder financial abuse and asset protection, someone who had seen situations like mine before. I found her on the third page of results. Margaret Ossie, J.D., a partner at Ossie and Brandt, specializing in elder law, guardianship disputes, and estate litigation. Her firm was in Millbrook, 22 miles from Maple Creek Road, far enough that it was unlikely any of my children would drive past and see my Honda in the parking lot. Her reviews mentioned phrases like fierce advocate and doesn't back down. I wrote her number on a slip of paper, folded it into my coat pocket, and drove home. I called from my cell phone, parked in the far corner of the Kroger parking lot, engine running. Margaret Ossie's assistant answered. I explained that I needed a consultation urgently, that I was a 74-year-old woman with concerns about family members attempting to gain unauthorized control of my finances. The assistant put me on hold for 90 seconds. When she came back, she gave me an appointment for Friday at 10. In the 2 days before that appointment, I noticed the first signs that my children were beginning to sense a shift in atmosphere, though they could not have known why. Linda called on Thursday afternoon, chipper and casual, mentioning that she had been speaking with a lovely woman at an estate planning firm in Richmond who had such good ideas for families in our situation. She asked whether I had given any more thought to the power of attorney paperwork. I told her I had not been feeling well and I would think about things next week. She said, "Of course. No rush. Take care of yourself." Her voice was warm. Her voice was always warm. Robert texted that evening. "Just checking in, Mom. Let me know if you need anything." A text he had never sent in his life before the past 8 months. I kept my face neutral. I kept my voice easy. And on Friday morning, I drove to Millbrook. Margaret Ossie was 50-something, compact, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She had the kind of stillness that made you feel she had heard everything and was surprised by nothing. I sat across from her mahogany desk and I told her everything. The overheard conversation, word for word as best I could reconstruct it. The brochures for senior communities, the questions about my cognitive health, the coordinated visits, the sudden, organized interest in estate planning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Mrs. Callahan, what you've described is a textbook setup for elder financial exploitation. It's not yet a crime, but it will be if they succeed in obtaining that power of attorney under false pretenses or through undue influence." She explained my options. She recommended 3 immediate actions. First, she would draft a new will, one that explicitly reflected my current wishes and was witnessed and notarized outside any family involvement. Second, she would help me establish a revocable living trust, which would place my house and accounts under managed terms that could not be easily altered by anyone I did not explicitly authorize. Third, she strongly advised that I document everything, all conversations, all texts, all voicemails, and keep those records somewhere outside my home. I left her office 2 hours later with a folder of intake paperwork and the first solid ground I had felt beneath my feet since April. That same afternoon, I received the first direct evidence of my children's plans. And it arrived not through eavesdropping, but through an entirely ordinary mistake. Patricia, who sometimes muddled her contacts, sent me a text, clearly meant for Linda. It read, "She hasn't signed anything yet. R says she seemed distracted on the phone. We need to move faster. Should we call Dr. Marsh and mention the confusion episodes?" I read it 3 times. Then I took a screenshot. Then I forwarded it to Margaret Osei's email. Confusion episodes. There were no confusion episodes. But if they could plant that idea with my physician, suggest to Dr. Marsh that I was showing signs of cognitive decline, it could become the foundation for a legal argument that I lacked capacity to manage my own affairs. That was the play. That was the whole play. I sat in my car in the Kroger lot again. It had become my thinking spot, that far corner by the cart return, and I breathed slowly and steadily. I thought, now I understand exactly what I am dealing with. The trust documents took 10 days to finalize. During those 10 days, I lived a quiet double life. On the surface, I was the same mother I had always been, answering calls, responding to texts, accepting Robert's Sunday visits with coffee and pound cake from the bakery on 5th. Underneath, I was working. Margaret had connected me with a fee-only financial advisor named Charles Webb, a calm, methodical man in his 60s who helped me reorganize my accounts. We moved my Fidelity investments into the Living Trust. The savings account was retitled. Margaret drafted the new will, which named not my children, but my niece, Carolyn, Gerald's brother's daughter, a level-headed woman of 48 who lived in Asheville and had no stake in my estate beyond whatever I chose to give her, as executor. I also updated my healthcare proxy to name Carolyn rather than Linda, who had held that designation for 12 years. I did all of this quietly, in offices 20 miles from home, paying with a check drawn from an account my children had no knowledge of. A small account I had maintained at a credit union since the early 90s, a relic of the years when I had kept a small household fund separate from our joint account. Gerald had known about it. My children had not. It held about $6,000, more than enough. The moment everything came apart in their direction was a Tuesday in May. Linda called in the morning with a document attached to an email. A power of attorney form, pre-filled with my name, asking me to simply review and sign in front of a notary she had conveniently arranged at a location near my home. Her email explained that this was just a precaution, completely standard for someone your age, nothing to worry about. She included a note from Robert at the bottom, endorsing the idea, and a short paragraph from Patricia saying how much peace of mind it would give the family. I forwarded the email to Margaret. Then I called Linda and said very calmly that I had been thinking about estate matters myself and had already made some arrangements. I mentioned, also calmly, that I had retained an attorney. The pause on the other end of that call lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, I could almost hear the machinery of Linda's composure seizing up. "An attorney," she repeated. "Yes," I said. "Margaret Osei, in Millbrook. Very capable woman." Another pause. "Mom, that seems... we're family. You don't need to get lawyers involved in family matters." "I think I do," I said pleasantly. "She's helped me get everything sorted out very nicely." Linda said she had to go. She hung up. Within 48 hours, all 3 of them were at my door. They arrived on a Thursday evening, uninvited. Linda knocked. She had never knocked before, had always let herself in, which told me she was already on uncertain footing. I opened the door and looked at 3 faces arranged in a tight, coordinated concern. They came in, they sat in my living room, and then Linda dropped the pretense of warmth entirely. "You've changed the will," she said. It was not a question. "I've done a number of things," I said. "Mom?" Robert leaned forward, elbows on knees. "We are trying to protect you. You're alone out here. What happens if something happens to you? What happens if..." "If I become confused?" I said. I watched his face carefully. "Like Patricia mentioned to Linda in that text message?" Patricia went white. And in that moment, that single clarifying moment, every remaining doubt I had ever felt dissolved completely. What followed was not a pleasant conversation. Linda accused me of being manipulated by strangers with financial interests. Robert said that Carolyn, whom he barely knew, had no business being involved in our family. Patricia cried, which had always been her most effective weapon and which now landed like rain on stone. I sat in Gerald's armchair and I listened, and when they had finished, I said, "I understand you're upset, but what you were planning is not going to happen. If anyone contacts Dr. Marsh with false information about my cognitive health, Margaret will know about it within the hour. If anyone attempts to file any legal document on my behalf without my explicit written consent, I have already spoken with her about next steps." The room went very quiet. They left. They did not slam the door, which surprised me. Linda paused on the porch and turned back with an expression I had never seen on her face. Something that was not anger exactly, but the close cousin of it. Something humiliated and calculating. After they drove away, I locked the door and sat down in the kitchen. My hands were trembling slightly. I was 74 years old, and I had just confronted my 3 children with their own plan to rob me. I poured myself 2 fingers of Gerald's bourbon, the good bottle I kept on the top shelf, and I drank it slowly. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days of not answering calls beyond a brief text to say I was resting. 3 days of walking in the backyard, sitting under Gerald's oak, reading novels, watching old films. I had earned those 3 days. The enticement came on the 5th day. Linda sent flowers. Not just any flowers. She sent a large arrangement from Hillcroft Florist, the same shop where Gerald had ordered my birthday bouquets for 40 years. Stargazer lilies and white roses, my favorites. The card read, "We love you, Mom. We're sorry things got tense. Can we start over?" All 3 names were signed. I put the flowers on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. They were genuinely beautiful. And that was precisely the point, wasn't it? They knew my preferences, my soft places, the memories attached to certain flowers from a particular shop. They were not sorry. They were recalibrating. A day later, Robert called. His voice was low and gentle, the voice he used when he wanted something. I had recognized it since he was 14. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he realized they had gone about things the wrong way. He said he only wanted to know that I was taken care of. He floated, almost as an afterthought, the idea of a family meeting. Just the four of us, no attorneys, keeping it in the family. "I'll think about it," I told him. I said it with warmth. I had no intention of thinking about it. Patricia texted a long message. Very long, the kind she sent when she was working through guilt or performing guilt and could not easily be interrupted. She spoke of her childhood, of memories in that house, of how much she missed her father. It was, I admit, beautifully written. Patricia had always been the most talented of the three, and somewhere in the middle of it, between the memory of Christmas mornings and the note about missing Gerald's voice, was a gentle suggestion that perhaps I should consider simplifying my arrangements, that the trust and the new will might be creating unnecessary complications for the family. Simplifying. What a word to choose. I read the message twice, filed it in a folder on my phone that I had labeled plainly documentation, and sent it to Margaret. What I needed now was not legal advice. I had that. What I needed was the kind of support that doesn't come from attorneys or financial advisors, the kind that comes from people who know you and do not want anything from you. I called my friend Beverly. Beverly Hutchins and I had taught third and second grade side by side at Crestwood Elementary for 19 years. She was 71, still sharp as a tack, and she had lost her own husband 4 years before me. I drove to her house on a Wednesday afternoon and sat in her kitchen, which smelled of coffee and the oatmeal cookies she made every week, and I told her everything. Beverly listened the way only old friends listen, without surprise and without drama. When I finished, she put her hand over mine on the table and said, "Dorothy, I need you to hear me. What they're doing has a name, and you are handling it exactly right." She was not the only one I reached out to. My neighbor, Frank DeLuca, 76, widower, former contractor, sharp eyes, and not much patience for nonsense, had noticed the increased traffic at my house and quietly asked if everything was all right. I told him enough that he understood. Frank said he would keep an eye on things. He meant it practically, and I was grateful for the practicality. At church that Sunday, First Methodist on Greenbrier, where Gerald and I had attended for 30 years, I spoke briefly with Pastor Ann Cortland after the service. I did not give her details, but I told her I was going through a difficult family situation and would appreciate her prayers. She held my hands, looked me steadily in the eye, and said, "Dorothy, you are one of the strongest women I know. Trust yourself." I drove home with the windows down, even though it was cool, because I needed the air on my face. I thought about what it meant to have people, real people, people who remembered you before you became a problem to be managed. Beverly, Frank, Pastor Ann, Margaret, Charles. I was not alone. I had not been alone this whole time. I had simply forgotten to look up from my fear long enough to see who was standing beside me. They came on a Saturday afternoon in June, 11 days after the flowers and the phone calls and Patricia's long text message. All three, again. Linda brought a coffee cake from the bakery. My bakery, the one on 5th. Robert held the door for her, and Patricia carried a small arrangement of sunflowers. They had dressed well. They had prepared. Standing on my porch in a row, they looked like a photograph from a family calendar. Warm, coordinated, wholesome. It was an impressive production. I had to give them that. I had known they would come. Beverly had warned me. They'll try once more to do it nicely before they escalate or give up entirely. Be ready. I let them in. I made coffee. I set out plates for the cake because I was still their mother, and some habits are older than betrayal. We sat in the living room, the same living room where, 2 months ago, I had stood in the dark hallway and heard my life being divided up like furniture at an estate sale. I sat in Gerald's armchair. They arranged themselves on the sofa and the love seat, close together, a unified front with a veneer of warmth. The sunflowers Patricia had brought sat in a vase on the side table, bright and cheerful, entirely out of place. Linda opened. She was very good at opening. "Mom," she said, setting her mug down with deliberate care, "we've all had time to reflect, and we want to say that we understand why you felt frightened. We handled things clumsily. We came on too strong. But our intentions, our real intentions, have always been about love and protection." She paused. She waited for me to fill the silence with reassurance, the way I had filled silences for 50 years of motherhood. I did not. "The trust," Robert continued, picking up the thread smoothly. "They had rehearsed this. I could feel the seams of it. It's actually quite limiting. Did Margaret explain all the implications? There are tax situations and long-term care scenarios that a trust can complicate. We've spoken to a specialist, and he agrees that a simpler arrangement would actually protect you better." A specialist. They had hired a counter-expert. They had spent money on this. The calculation behind that decision told me everything I needed to know about how much they still believed they could win. "We just want what's best for you," Patricia said softly. Her eyes were moist. They were always moist when she needed them to be. "We're your children. We've known you our whole lives. Some attorney you just met doesn't know you the way we do. She doesn't know how Dad used to finish your sentences or how you still sleep on your side of the bed even though he's gone. She doesn't know you, Mom. We do." It was a beautiful appeal. Patricia had always been the most talented of the three, and she brought that talent to spoken manipulation as naturally as breathing. She was using the most intimate details of my grief as a crowbar. I felt it land. I will not pretend I did not. And then I watched the feeling pass, the way you watch a cloud cross the sun, and the sun is still there when it's gone. I looked at my 3 children, this woman of 51, this man of 48, this woman of 45, and I thought about what it had cost them to come here and say these words. They had swallowed a great deal of pride for this performance. They had coordinated their clothes, their gifts, their arguments, hired a specialist, which meant the prize still mattered enough to swallow all of it. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "I appreciate the coffee cake. And I want you to know that I have heard everything you've said." Linda's shoulders dropped slightly with relief. Premature relief. The kind that comes from confusing silence with agreement. "But I'm not going to change my arrangements," I continued evenly, without raising my voice. "Not the trust, not the will, not the executor. Margaret has reviewed everything thoroughly, and I am satisfied." The warmth in the room curdled instantly, like watching ice form over a pond, visible and swift. Robert set his mug down too hard. Linda's jaw tightened. Patricia's moist eyes dried with a speed that confirmed what I had suspected about them. "Mom," Linda said, and the Richmond voice was gone now. Something flatter and harder underneath it. "Do you understand that if something happens to you, a fall, an illness, Carolyn would be making decisions about your care? Carolyn, who visits twice a year. Is that what you want? A stranger making decisions while we're left standing outside? I have a healthcare proxy and an advance directive, I said. Margaret prepared them. Carolyn has copies. Dr. Marsh has copies. This attorney has really gotten into your head, Robert said, a muscle working in his cheek. She's a businesswoman, Mom. You're a client to her. We are your family. She's helped me think clearly, I said. There's a difference between someone getting into your head and someone helping you use it. Patricia stood up. She paced to the window, Gerald's window, with the view of his oak tree, 46 years old and solid as anything on this earth, and turned back. Something genuine had broken through the performance, and what was underneath was not love, but frustration. The raw irritation of someone who has run a careful plan and watched it refuse to work. You're being stubborn, and you're going to regret it, Mother. You're isolating yourself from your own family because of paranoia, and one day you will be alone and sick, and you'll wish you'd listened. You'll be in some facility, and Carolyn will be in Asheville, and we won't be allowed to help because you signed papers that shut us out completely. Is that the future you want? The word paranoia was deliberate. So was facility. Every word had been chosen. Even the anger, I suspected, had been at least partially planned. A last resort. The emotional card played when the reasonable ones had failed. You should go, I said. There was a moment. 5, 6 seconds, long enough to feel like a full minute, where no one moved. The sunflowers sat in their vase. The coffee cake sat on its plate. The house was very quiet around us. Then Linda picked up her purse, the motion sharp and final. Robert stood, said nothing, buttoned his jacket with the mechanical precision of a man suppressing a great deal. Patricia stayed by the window a moment longer, looking at me with frustrated fury mixed with something that might, in a different family, have been grief. Then she walked out without another word. I sat in that armchair after they left and felt, for the first time, something unexpected. Fear. Not of them exactly, but of the future Patricia had described. Alone, sick, isolated. It was a vicious image, planted with surgical precision, because she knew me well enough to know exactly where to press. But here is what fear, when it is honest, can do. It can clarify. Every threat they made was a precise measure of how much they stood to lose. And the more they had to lose, the more right I had been to protect myself. Fear was not my enemy. It was information. I picked up my phone and texted Beverly. They came. I held. She replied within 60 seconds. I knew you would. Coffee tomorrow? I replied, yes. Bring the oatmeal cookies. I set the phone down, looked at Gerald's oak through the window, and felt the fear settle into something quieter and more useful. Resolve. The climax came not in my living room, but in Margaret O'Sea's conference room on a Tuesday morning in late July. It was Margaret who had suggested the meeting. She had received information, through proper legal channels, that Robert had contacted Dr. Marsh's office 3 weeks earlier, representing himself on the phone as my primary caregiver and raising concerns about my mental state. He had used that phrase, cognitive episodes. He had suggested that I might be making decisions inconsistent with my best interests. Dr. Marsh's office, to their considerable credit, had not acted on the call, but they had documented it, and Margaret had obtained that documentation. Additionally, Patricia's misdirected text message, combined with 2 subsequent voicemails Linda had left me in which she referenced the need to move things along before it gets legally complicated, had given Margaret enough to formally advise my children, through a certified letter, that she was representing me and that any further attempts to interfere with my legally established financial arrangements or to misrepresent my cognitive status to medical professionals would be met with appropriate legal action. The certified letter had produced a furious response from Linda, who had hired an attorney of her own, a man named Garrett Powell, whose practice was in Richmond and who specialized, his website informed me, in family estate matters. She had sent me a letter through Powell suggesting that my newly established instruments, the trust, the will, might be challengeable on grounds of undue influence, specifically implying that Margaret had manipulated a vulnerable, elderly client. Margaret had read Powell's letter and described it without expression as an overreach. She had then suggested that we invite all 3 of my children, along with Powell if he chose to attend, to a meeting. They came. I arrived at Margaret's office 20 minutes early. I had dressed deliberately. My navy wool blazer, the one I wore to parent-teacher conferences for 30 years. The one Gerald always said made me look like someone who had already decided the outcome of any argument before it began. I sat in the conference room and looked out the window at the parking lot and watched their cars pull in, one by one. Linda's silver Volvo first, then Robert's truck, then the rental Patricia had taken from the airport. They stood briefly together in the parking lot before coming in, a small, instinctive huddle, and I watched them and felt nothing except a calm, clear readiness. Powell was a large, confident man in his mid-50s with silver cufflinks and the practiced ease of someone accustomed to intimidating rooms. Linda sat to his left, composed. Robert was to her right, quieter than I had seen him. The kind of quiet that comes from someone who knows the ground is less solid than it was. Patricia sat at the end of the table, and she had the expression of a person who has been arguing for months and is running low on conviction. Margaret sat across from them. I sat beside Margaret. Margaret opened by placing 3 documents on the table. The first was the documentation from Dr. Marsh's office, the record of Robert's call, with the date, the time, and a summary of what had been said. Robert looked at it. He did not speak. He reached for his water glass, then seemed to think better of it, and put his hand flat on the table instead, as if steadying himself. The second document was a transcript, prepared by a transcription service, of Linda's 2 voicemails. Margaret had played the voicemails themselves into a recording device during a call to my phone, with my knowledge and consent, in a state where one-party consent is legal. Linda's face, reading the transcript, was the color of old chalk. She turned to Powell and said something very low. Powell touched her arm briefly, the gesture of a lawyer telling a client to be quiet. The third document was Patricia's misdirected text, printed and certified. Powell leaned over and spoke quietly to Linda. Linda shook her head once, sharply. "What your clients have described as concern for their mother's welfare," Margaret said, her voice level as a carpenter's rule, "is, in the documented record, a coordinated effort to establish false grounds for a competency challenge, in advance of attempting to obtain power of attorney and control of Mrs. Callahan's assets. The text message alone establishes premeditation. The call to Dr. Marsh's office, with your client identifying himself as her primary caregiver, which he is not, legally or practically, may constitute fraudulent misrepresentation to a medical provider." Powell started to speak. Margaret raised one hand, very slightly, and continued. "Mrs. Callahan's estate instruments are sound. She had a complete cognitive evaluation by Dr. Marsh 6 months ago, at my recommendation, which found her fully competent. The evaluation is on record. Any challenge to the trust or the will on grounds of incapacity or undue influence will fail, and it will fail expensively." She looked at Powell. Powell looked at his cufflinks. "What I would recommend to your clients," Margaret said, is that they consider carefully whether the cost of litigation, financial, familial, and reputational, is worth a contest they will not win. The silence in that room was the kind that has weight. I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could hear Patricia breathing. Robert was looking at the surface of the conference table with the focused attention of a man who has run out of options and knows it. Linda had her hands folded in her lap, very still in the way she held herself when she was working very hard to maintain composure. I knew that posture. I had seen it first when she was 9 years old, sitting across from a school principal, trying not to cry. I had not spoken a single word during the meeting. I had sat beside Margaret with my hands folded on the table, and I had looked, in turn, at each of my 3 children. I looked at Linda, who had arranged flowers from my favorite shop. I looked at Robert, who had printed brochures for senior communities. I looked at Patricia, who had cried in my living room and called it love. When Margaret finished, I spoke. I said, quietly and without heat, "I want you to know that I don't hate you, but I want you to understand very clearly that I am not confused. I am not vulnerable. I am not going to sign anything or change anything. And if any of you attempts to involve my doctor, my neighbors, or anyone else in an effort to undermine what I have put in place, Margaret will hear about it before sunset." Robert's jaw worked. Linda looked at the table. Patricia pressed her lips together and looked at the window. Gerald's oak would not have been visible from this room, but she looked toward where trees might be, the way people look away when they have nothing left to say. Powell gathered his papers. He said he would need to consult further with his client. He said it in a way that meant the meeting was over. It was over. Garrett Powell withdrew from the case within 3 weeks of that meeting. Linda received his letter on a Thursday, forwarded it to Robert and Patricia, and called me, I was later told by Carolyn, from her car in a parking garage, where she cried for half an hour. I do not know what she cried about. Her losses, her exposure, her own reflection, perhaps all 3. I was not there. I was in my garden, staking tomatoes, my hands in the soil, the late afternoon sun warm on my back. It was, I remember thinking, a very good afternoon. Powell's withdrawal letter cited, in formal language, an unfavorable evidentiary landscape and limited grounds for challenge. What that meant, translated from legal into plain English, was this: the documentation Margaret had assembled made any legal contest not merely difficult, but essentially unwinnable. Robert's call to Dr. Marsh's office, Patricia's misdirected text, Linda's voicemails. Together, they did not merely fail to establish incapacity. They established the opposite, a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation by my children, which would have been far more damaging to their position than helpful to it if the matter ever reached a courtroom. Without legal representation willing to pursue a challenge that the documentation had effectively foreclosed, my children had no mechanism. The trust stood. The will stood. Carolyn remained executor. My healthcare proxy remained in Carolyn's name. Every instrument Margaret and I had put in place held exactly as we had designed it to hold, quietly, firmly, without drama. I received one more letter through official channels, this one from Powell's office, formally confirming withdrawal and stating that his clients would not be pursuing further action. Margaret called me when she received her copy. Her voice was, as always, professionally even, but there was something at the edge of it, a warmth, a quiet satisfaction, that I appreciated more than any formal congratulation would have been. "It's done," she said. "It's done," I agreed. Robert made one final attempt. Not legal, not formal, but personal. He came to the house on a Sunday evening in August, alone, without Linda or Patricia. He sat at Gerald's kitchen table and he looked older than I had ever seen him look, older than his 48 years. The way people look when something they believed about themselves has been disproven, and they haven't yet worked out what to believe instead. He said he was sorry. He said it without qualification, without pivot, without the word but following it. He said he had told himself he was protecting me, and he had known somewhere underneath that it was not entirely true, and he had chosen not to look at what was underneath. I listened to him for a long time. The kitchen was quiet, just the tick of Gerald's old clock on the wall and the sound of the evening settling in. I believed Robert, partially. He had always been the most conflicted of the three, the one most capable of a certain kind of honesty when cornered by it, the one who had occasionally, over the years, called me simply to talk, not because he wanted something, but because he was lonely or uncertain, and I was his mother. That Robert was still in there somewhere, underneath the man who had called my doctor with false information. I could not pretend otherwise. But I also could not pretend the other thing had not happened. I told him that I heard him. I told him that I did not know yet what our relationship would look like going forward, and that he would have to live with that uncertainty for a while, because I was not prepared to reassure him before I was ready. He needed to understand that his remorse, however genuine, did not erase what had been planned. What would have happened to me, to this house, to everything Gerald and I had built, if I had not stood in that dark hallway on a Thursday night in April and listened? He nodded. He left. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years, possibly ever. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck disappear down Maple Creek Road, and I felt something complicated. Not forgiveness, not quite, but the first loosening of the knot that had been in my chest since spring. Linda did not call or visit for 4 months. When she finally called, in December, she was polite and surface level and did not mention any of it. I responded in kind. We spoke about her garden and the weather in Richmond. It was the beginning of something, not forgiveness exactly, but a form of civility that might, over time, if she chose to tend it honestly, grow into something more. Patricia was the hardest. She sent a card in September, a brief, formal card, the kind you send to an acquaintance, that said only, "I hope you are well, Mom." I sent one back that said the same. It was not enough, but it was something to work from if she ever chose to do the work. The most important outcome, the one that mattered practically and permanently, was what had been secured. The house on Maple Creek Road was held in trust, protected, outside the reach of anyone who might claim I had given it away in a moment of confusion. My accounts were structured. My will was clear. My healthcare decisions were in the hands of someone I trusted and who had no financial stake in the outcome. Margaret sent me a final bill in October. I paid it, happily, completely, without a moment's hesitation, and sent her a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for taking me seriously." She sent back a card. It read, "You took yourself seriously first. That's why it worked." I kept that card on the mantle, next to the photograph of Gerald and me on our 25th anniversary. Standing in front of this house, in front of the oak tree that was then only 23 years old and not yet taller than the roof. Every morning, making my coffee, I looked at that card. And every morning, it said the same true thing. That autumn was one of the best I can remember. I planted a new flower bed along the south side of the house, something I had been putting off for 3 years. And Beverly came over 2 Saturdays in a row to help me dig. We made a mess of Gerald's old gardening gloves and laughed about it. Frank DeLuca repaired my back fence and accepted a loaf of cranberry bread instead of payment. Pastor Ann and I began meeting for coffee on the first Wednesday of every month, which became something I looked forward to with unreasonable fondness. I signed up in January for a watercolor class at the Millbrook Community Arts Center. I had not painted since before Gerald died. I was not good at it. My water tends to run, and my color sense, according to my instructor Priya, is exuberant. I did not mind being exuberant. Carolyn visited in February. She drove up from Asheville and spent 4 days, sleeping in the guest room, eating my cooking, walking with me in the evenings. She was easy to be with in the way that people are easy when they want nothing from you. On the last night, we sat at Gerald's table with a bottle of wine and talked until midnight. She said she was honored to be named in the documents and hoped she never had to act on any of it for a very long time. I told her I hoped the same. My days had a shape again. Morning coffee in Gerald's kitchen, the radio low, light through the east window. Watercolor on Tuesdays, church on Sundays, Beverly on Wednesdays. A call with Carolyn every other week. At my regular appointment, Dr. Marsh noted with genuine pleasure that my blood pressure was better than it had been in 2 years. I slept well. That was not a small thing. As for my children, life arranged its own consequences, as it tends to do. Linda's husband, Craig, discovered that autumn that she had been quietly moving their joint household money into a personal account without his knowledge, through a paper statement that arrived while she was out of town. I learned of it from a mutual cousin at Christmas. The irony was not lost on me. Linda, who had sat in my living room strategizing about consolidating my assets, had been running the same play at home. Craig filed for separation in November. The process was expensive and unpleasant. Robert lost his position at the logistics company where he had worked for 12 years. Something about expense reports, a company card used for personal purchases. He called in February asking to borrow money. I declined gently and gave him the name of a financial counselor Margaret had recommended. He did not mention the money when he finally called again 2 months later. Patricia's unraveling in Denver was quieter. She had been passed over twice for an expected promotion, and her second serious relationship in 3 years had ended badly. I knew through Carolyn, who maintained a wider family correspondence than I did not reach out to gloat. But I noticed, with quiet acknowledgement, that the futures my children had been so certain of had not arranged themselves as expected. I thought about the oak tree in the backyard. Gerald had planted it the year Robert was born, and it was now the tallest thing on the property. He had known he would never see it fully grown. He had planted it anyway. For me, I understood now. For the years after him. For the woman who would sit under it, gather herself, and go on. I went on. Here is what 50 years taught me, and what one April night confirmed. What would you have done standing in that dark hallway? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe. There are more where this came from. Thank you for listening. It meant everything.